Hello, everyone. Welcome to another collaboration episode between Pekinology, Baiguan, and East 8. My name is Robert Wu. I'm the CEO of Baiguan Lab, an alternative data company, and I also write at Baiguan and China Translated newsletters. With me is Zicheng Wang of Pekinology and also a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And also Johnny Zhou, who write at East 8 Substack and head of venture capital at a leading private equity fund in China. Okay, so obviously today we're going to focus a lot on the trade war again. A lot has happened in the last week. I think in hindsight, maybe years later, the future generations will view this week as pretty historic. So Zicheng, I think you are the only professional journalist of us three. Could you take us through what happened of the last week? And we should start from there.
Well, I don't even know where to begin. I was a professional journalist until I guess like somewhere in 2022, but currently my full-time job is being a mid-career student and, with a lot of thanks to Princeton. And so basically, it was like poker, right? Like the US was betting and China was like matching, and then the US was like all in and China was all in. And then, like, I think 10 hours ago or something, like the United States made some very surprising exemptions of the Chinese goods it has put under like 145% tariffs, including like smartphones and consumer electronics. I think there were a lot of news reports, including like I think reports from U.S. media, which was saying like when the U.S. was hiking its tariffs on China, it somehow secretly attempted to tell the Chinese side that you must not retaliate against our tariffs. But I mean, I don't know, if it reached Beijing or who exactly it reached in Beijing. But like China, just as it repeatedly warned that it would match any punitive tariffs that the U.S. has put into place. And so the US doubled down, and a dramatic turn is that the US then withdrew like the majority of its tariffs on other major trading partners except China. But still it kept in place like 10% extra tariffs on other trading partners. And Beijing just didn't move an inch. And so it was really dramatic. And the stock market was upside down and I guess downside up and going up and down based on a whim of tweets from President Donald Trump. And I think US top officials, I mean, cabinet officials were claiming credit that like they somehow persuaded President Trump to withdraw their tariffs from other countries, but left the tariffs on Chinese exports in place. And naturally, there are two explanations, and I want to hear from you. Like, I think there is one theory out there, is that it was all carefully planned, that the United States was trying to flush China out by baiting Beijing to, impose retaliatory tariffs, and then withdrew like tariffs on other countries. So, China would face the United States alone. But there is another theory, which would be that none of this was well thought out or meticulously planned. Like they were just making stuff up and playing the game as it went, and nobody actually had any idea what was going to happen in the next 24 hours. So what do you think? Like, do you think it was carefully planned, like it was a China focused strategy, or like it's just what we have now. It's a total mess. And how do you think, like, how does Beijing approach these developments? Robert or Johnny?
Yeah, I'll start. I definitely don't think this is well planned. This is very whimsical. And my argument is, and my evidence is, if it is well planned, they should, deal with this whole sequence of events very differently. So, if they start with this 100% or whatever tariff on China, and a threat to incur maybe 10 or 20% on the rest of the world for some time, then even if that's a strategy in the very beginning, then yeah, probably it's pretty smart strategy designed to single out China and to exert maximum pressure to isolate China, right? But that's not what happened. What happened was, one day he just appeared there and he had this huge list of countries and non-country entities on the list, and just giving out arbitrarily high tariffs to almost everyone in the world. And we can't forget that, right? We can't forget that happened first. And then he just responded to all these different, countermeasures from China. And then he decided, okay, shit, we should forget about the rest of the world. We should just double down on China now, right? So I think this sequence of events is really important. I just wrote yesterday in my newsletter, China Translated, the dividing line between a genius and an idiot can be as thin as a sequence of events. So I definitely don't think it's well planned. And I think from the China side, I think the China side is pretty composed, I would say, this time. There are voices, there are people who said that the Chinese government is being irrational, Chinese government is being emotional. I have a totally different view. I don't think there's much emotion at all this time. It's just coldly calculated matching to whatever crazy move that the Trump administration is doing. And also, in the last few days, I met an economist from a leading European bank who came to Shanghai for a visit. And what I found interesting is he thought that his biggest takeaway from his China trip was that he was really surprised that Chinese consumers are not boycotting US goods, which is very interesting to him because, back at home, Europeans are boycotting American goods very emotionally. Well, on the China side, you don't see that much. And I think that started from the very top. Immediately after the China's announced countermeasures last week of 34% extra tariff, immediately after that, I think it's the vice minister of commerce actually met with the representatives of American businesses in China and basically reassure them that we are not going to retaliate against them. The meeting of President Xi and the foreign executives, which we talk about in this podcast before, the main message of President Xi was going to be preserved, right? So there was not a top down and bottom up. There was not a movement to boycott American goods. It's all business-like. It's all matter of fact, right? So I think this kind of self-confidence, this kind of composure is also pretty striking to me this time. Yeah, Johnny, what do you think?
I agree with you, Robert. I think first of all, the events, right, how it unfolded, is that the US side is really surprised that China really matched the retaliatory tariffs at a very fast speed. I think that's probably the breaking point for a lot of the decisions by the US because of the speed of the reaction. As a result of this, the US market actually dropped significantly, and it caused a sort of a panic. And this time, the panic is very unique and different from the previous panics that the US have suffered during COVID or even 2008. Is that usually when the stock market fall, the US Treasury yield will go down because the so-called flight to safety, right? And then the US dollar index will also go up because people will just hold US dollar in cash. But now this time, there's this phenomenon that the stock market falls, the bond market yield actually went up a lot, and the US dollar index went down, which means that people are staying away from the dollar. And if you look at like bilateral currency pairs, like Euro, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen, actually there's a lot of flow into these currencies. And this is something that I would say that the current administration actually fears the most. So there's this report that I think has a little bit of a credibility. Treasury Secretary Bessent is not fully aware, or at least he's not in the center of the sort of a negotiation table or the sort of decision universe. But it is right after the capital market turmoil, especially the three markets actually run synchronized in a different way, that Trump actually panicked and started to put Bessent in the centerpiece of negotiation and trying to calm the market a lot. So I would say, in terms of the sequence of events, I agree with Robert, is that China did it in a very cold and calculated way. And I even say that some of the timing is a lot more professional than it did in the past, because normally when they do these type of things, they announced it in the morning, which will affect the Chinese market. But now they are doing it every single time at 7 p.m. is right before the US market started. So yeah, I would say there's a lot of cold calculation in that, and that resulted in the US side actually falling apart a little bit. But obviously, they announced the relief of tariff for 90 days for the rest of the world, and then now relief for computers, laptops, cell phones. There's going to be a lot of changes in the coming days.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned was very critical, is that the treasury yields were going up and approaching some very key points. And I think President Trump also cited that development as his course correction. And that basically the United States is traditionally like the safe haven for investors. But because of this very erratic decision making and the unexpected tariffs on a massive scale, I think like the foreign investors and maybe even the traditional US allies' confidence in the US as a as a destination of a last resort, that began to shake. And there were almost, I think, other theories floating around, basically like maybe President Trump's strategy is not to have the US dollar as a global reserve currency, and it wants to turn the United States back into some sort of emerging economy, and in that way, so it could rebuild its industrial base and to not run so much trade deficit. And I think this goes far beyond the just basically bilateral trade deficits. And I think it's Robert was talking about like the European assessment. I also attended, some conferences, and I think the shock to the confidence to its allies is really tremendous. And naturally, like people would talk about, is the Chinese trying to take advantage of this situation geopolitically? So we see the movements on the Chinese side, including, the Chinese premier was talking to the president of the European Commission. The Chinese commerce minister had a phone call with the European commissioner in charge of trade. And the Spanish prime minister was visiting Beijing. And these changes, there was some like very notable developments in terms of China, EU. Basically, for example, China and the European Union are now negotiating price commitments by the Chinese side in terms of its EV exports to the EU, which previously was, in my understanding, as deadlocked because the EU was insisting on putting tariffs on Chinese EV exports rather than let the Chinese undertake price commitments. But now there is some change over there. And also like they were talking about trade diversion. And I think that's also very important because, the natural fear one could say is that if, the Chinese exports are shut out of the US consumer market, which is the largest in the world, like other markets, other economies would feel like where will these Chinese companies? I don't think it would be like the Chinese government. It doesn't have the means, the tools to tell the Chinese companies where you want to send your goods next. But so there was this fear, but by talking about the trade diversion between the EU and the Chinese, they were kind of preemptively addressing this potential trade diversion issue. And, in the meantime, as we speak now, I guess very soon the Chinese president is going to visit Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. Although, I suspect this was determined last week, it was probably well planned, quite some time ahead. But these are also countries that are exporters to the United States, especially when it comes to Vietnam. And the Chinese, the top Chinese leader will visit the place, and also the South China Morning Post was reporting, I think, yesterday, that the presidents of the European Council and the European Commission have agreed to visit China probably in July for a summit with the Chinese leader. So I think when the United States was initiating so many seismic changes, it's natural to expect others are coordinating and trying to find their way of responding to the crisis. And I'm not trying to say China and Europe will become best friends next day. I think there is a ceiling for their relationship. They have their own differences, which has been exacerbated by COVID, by the war in Ukraine. But still, I think countries across the world are trying to find a way to adapt to the changes.
Yeah. So what do you think? What do you think? What's the maximum that China and EU could agree on? Because I personally think that's maybe the most important relationship right now in this kind of Trumpian world. China and EU must find out some ways to collaborate and work together. But as you mentioned, there are also ceilings, right? So what do you think? Any predictions for that? Yeah.
Well, I think there is this bilateral investment accord, which was agreed upon by both sides politically, I think, at the end of 2019. But it has been frozen up in the air because of bilateral sanctions on each other. So I'm not sure there is a way to revive that. And at least from the readouts of their communications between China and the European Union, we are not seeing the very explicit signals about reviving that. But people are talking about, for example, I think there is a researcher based in Brussels, Dr. Wei Nian, who was trying to talk about is there a way to extract some regulatory agreement out of the CAI between China and European Union, and get something out of the tanked deal, and to basically facilitate some better investment access for both sides. And I think it's also quite interesting. I think a lot of countries have decided not to retaliate against the United States, some for very obvious reasons. But I think if let's say China was the firmest one, the one with the biggest resolute, there was no hesitation. I think the EU was still somehow, standing on its own grounds, preparing its own retaliatory actions. I think there was the talk of Greenland, of all this political interference with domestic affairs in the European politics, and now there is this trade war. I think it probably didn't help very much with tempering European response to the American tariff war. And there is one thing I do want to mention is that especially between China and the US, and this is the most important bilateral relations in the world. And, there was this tariff war with huge tariffs placed on each other's exports. Emotions are running high. I think it's very important that it would really be helpful that, the cooler minds on both sides could help compartmentalize the trade issue and contain it in a box, and do not let it spill over to other stuff personnel, travel, students exchanges, or even security or defense measures, because this is already too much on the plate. And when by all accounts there was not very good bilateral communications between them, especially between the decision makers at the top level. If something unexpected, there is some near miss between fighter planes or between naval vessels, that could really become very dangerous. A very concerning development is like, obviously the State Department is canceling international student visas here. It doesn't seem to, at least at this moment, it doesn't seem to be targeting Chinese students in the United States. Most of the cancellations, I think there is a tally run by, I don't know, maybe Times Higher Education. And it's not like dozens of cases, it's hundreds of cases now. And most of them seem to be related to student protests in Gaza, and at least at this moment, it doesn't seem to be focused on Chinese students. And let's hope that stays that way. Well, I'm not saying like canceling the student visas of foreign students on U.S. university campuses to ask for accountability on Gaza situation. That's a good thing. I'm not saying that, but let's at least say it would really be helpful to not let the trade war spill over to other fronts.
I'm actually not so optimistic about the China EU sort of trade situation because of two reasons. One is I think the China top leadership has a very complicated emotion with the EU current leadership, especially von der Leyen. I don't think there's much of a trust between the two sides to really to get the deal done, right? Especially I think after COVID, after so many things. The second is I think EU and China has a lot of industries that are currently competing with each other. I mean, EV is just one starking example. And so obviously they're trying to make a deal out of this, but it's going to be complicated, especially the US policy against China will change. And should that change be, softer or even harsher in the future, will dramatically change the trade relationship between China and EU. And I have to say that the EU sort of side is a bit slow in terms of response in a lot of things. And so that's not going to bode too well, I think, going into the future. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I just checked some data. So US trade deficit to China is about 300 billion USD of last year. And between China and EU, the trade deficit is actually even higher at about 300 billion euros. So yeah, I mean, within this kind of framework, it's really hard unless, I don't know, maybe EU starts to sell, the EUV machines and more airplanes to China. Otherwise, this trade imbalance is also pretty serious there. Yeah, just to add this color there. So Chen, I also have a question for you. So some people are saying that yesterday's decision, Trump's office decision to apply exemptions to certain categories is a sign of them kind of backing down a little bit. Do you think China will use this occasion to, see it as an off-ramp and also kind of respond with similar type of policies?
Well, you're really putting me on the spot. And one thing that I think, and I think Johnny was right, like the US seems to be caught by surprise at the Chinese response, especially in such a speedy manner. But come on, like Beijing has messaged enough before this round of, new tariff hikes, like for people who really follow the messages out of Beijing, for people who read, China Translated, for people who read Baiguan, who read Technology and East 8, it was crystal clear that, there was no way that, Beijing was gonna, make concessions in face of such extreme pressure campaign. Let's not talk about, whether it was like right or wrong, maybe I'll wait for a few days to basically, to let President Trump stand there against all countries, whether, how to respond to that in a more tactical manner. But there was no question whatsoever that Beijing was gonna, drop its knees and send its officials to Washington, D.C. to beg for some sort of like, space from the United States. And from the, I think from the, also from a technical point of view, the appeasement of such very aggressive and erratic behavior is seen as inviting basically the next round of tariffs or sanctions, export controls, or other punitive containment from the United States. So there was like no question that Beijing would respond very forcefully. It should have been a no-brainer for anyone who actually studies China, and a lot of like former U.S. government officials with expertise on China, they all said similar things on Twitter. And I think, although like the Trump administration has on a Friday evening, I guess, when, Friday is a time when the government want to make its Friday news dump, it's the sort of stuff that the federal government doesn't want it to be like in the headlines. So they kind of, chose this particular time out of a week so that it could evade the spotlight. And that's seen as some sort of concession. But, it's still from Beijing's perspective, this is like unprovoked. And like, I think Beijing is feeling like, this is something, we didn't start this, like you started this. And it's like, you were like stepping on my foot, like with applying pressure by 100%. And now you are just using, let's say, 65% of the pressure. And I'm not sure that's like a good enough, or, to give Beijing some sort of flexibility to, also send some signals to find an alternative path. I think Beijing's, if you really ask me to pick a side, I guess my guess would be that Beijing is still waiting for the United States to make more moves, to poster for like some sort of way of negotiation, and maybe talk more respectfully. Yeah, that would be my assessment.
I
This
agree.
is a very interesting question, actually, is that who's gonna make the call from the US side? Because I saw the interview of Commerce Secretary Lutnick. He said he doesn't have any contacts in China. And given that Marco Rubio is not able to even travel to China, who's gonna make the call?
Musk, I guess.
But Musk is being sidelined from the trade talks, right?
Well,
I think
this is maybe the moment for him to grab the stage. You heard of rumors of Navarro, all these people maybe sidelined again, right? I mean, you don't know where the wind is blowing, but if I have to bet, maybe Musk is the best candidate in this. I mean, watch out for his tweets.
Yeah, I just want to add one very tiny technicality, is that I think, the exemptions announced, like 10 or 12 hours ago, some part of the exemptions were not expected. If you really go back to the executive order on April 2nd, like if you read the fine print of the order, there is some article in that says basically some things would be like exempt. And so the very latest announcement actually was just enforcing that, very invisible article within the executive order of April 2nd. Yeah.
That's also something that I completely, is been blown away by the US administration, is that they only picked, because of Apple, right? And there are so many goods that are so reliant on Chinese imports. Some categories like Christmas trees and water bottles and artificial flowers, and these are not exempted. But, because of our friends in Apple Cook, and, it's
Apple
exempted.
Cook.
So yeah, I'm completely blown away by the exemption. Is that I think this totally means that these big companies have a lot of power over decision making. And even I think we're only into these high tariffs like 2 to 3 days probably. and it's called off. But the US consumers has a lot to lose for the next, couple of months, because a lot of their day-to-day items is gonna see a dramatic increase in prices. And I'm not sure if the inflation or the Census Bureau can make up good inflation numbers anymore to make the case for Donald Trump saying that, oh, the inflation is contained so that, we can have a interest rate decline or interest rate cut. I don't think it's going to happen.
I think it would also be interesting to look at, whether recent events would really accelerate some long overdue, badly needed domestic reform or stimulus on the Chinese side, because, whether the US would, let's say, put in more exemptions or maybe lower the tariffs, let's say after some negotiations. But I mean, definitely Beijing has been spooked, and as many other countries in the world. So, the Chinese have been trying to basically grow its domestic market for quite a few years, but the results, let's just say, has been mixed so far. And so I think like it would really like accelerate the resolve, the urgency of basically how to grow the domestic consumer market. But what will Chinese government really do? Like, will it put in more so-called trade-in subsidies for consumer electronics, or maybe expand the subsidy programs to, for example, services trades, expand them to basically, if you eat at a restaurant, the government would like subsidize you, let's say 10%, 15%, or it would do something maybe more fundamental. So I think I published a newsletter yesterday on technology, where I basically looked at, the suggestions given by Chinese economists, including, Yao Yang and Lu Feng at National School of Development at Peking University, of Robin Xing, the chief economist at Morgan Stanley, who was talking at a forum of China Microeconomy Forum of the Renmin University of China, and there were like the remarks by David Daoquai Li at Tsinghua University and Hua Sheng at Southeast University. I think there were some like agreements between them. Like a lot of them were calling, I think all of them basically were calling for, giving substantial like social benefits to poor people, especially migrant workers in China, or older people whose pension, because they have been living in rural areas, they have been receiving like very small pension, 40, 50 US dollars per month. They were calling for this sort of like domestic subsidy to these poor people. And also I think some of them were talking about, the lackluster domestic consumption was partly a result of the housing, the real estate market, and also like the Chinese local governments, they have benefited from the debt swap, but their spending hasn't improved too much. So some economists was talking about, there should be more measures to stabilize the housing market, to really, incentivize, to push the local government to pay its due to the private firms where they were owed money by the local governments. So I think people were saying it is always like crisis that leads to real reforms. And obviously, China is undergoing significant challenges from this trade war, where it spurs some necessary domestic economic reform. And that's something. And also, the Chinese premier Li Qiang was sitting down with, I think, 3 economists and also some entrepreneurs, asking for their advice. So that we should also keep an eye on that front.
Yeah, talking about that, I'm actually a little bit disappointed by the speed that they are announcing related policies for the last 1 or 2 weeks. I mean, too much of attention has been paid to the tariff war, but I thought that concurrently they would announce a few really, blockbuster kind of policies in terms of domestic demand. What do you think, when exactly, about when will they roll out something that you've been talking about? I thought it was all kind of pre-planned so they can, if there's a moment to unleash this policy, maybe right now is the time, right? Given the extremity of the trade war already. So any thoughts on the timing here?
I think it's likely going to be end of April, because that's going to be when the Politburo holds its meeting. I think there's probably a lot of plans on the table, but certainly needs the leadership to make a call on this. I'm actually, Zizhen talked about different economists suggesting basically is helicoptering a bit of the money around. I think it's going to be pretty interesting for the government to think about the current structure of the Chinese consumption, which is, I think there is a generational difference of consumption pattern. Like if you think about like our parents in their 60s and 70s, right? They have a lot of assets and their consumption power is okay. Some of them, their retired salary is higher than a lot of the people who's currently working, who's in their 30s and 40s. I think the problem of China right now is a lot of the younger generation and the people in their middle ages is under a lot of stress in terms of financially or economically because of the property decline. It could be because of the kids' education takes up a lot of energy and money. It could be both, right? And so considering the age difference, the generational difference in terms of how you roll out the sort of consumption or demand boosting strategies will be crucial to the success. Because if you use a blanket approach or you use like an income group approach, I would say that will be a little bit of at least defeating a lot of the purposes that you're trying to do here. You're trying to stimulate the consumption of those who are in their sort of golden ages of consumption, not those who are already well off, or not those who are in the proximity to consume is a bit, low. So that's also my view.
So what's your suggestion for the best strategy here? Do you have any favorite policy in mind, Johnny?
I actually I fully echo your view that it's a little bit disappointing. I remember about a month ago, or maybe less than a month ago, I think it's Hu He launched a strategy trying to give out subsidies for those who have a third kid. And I think it's like 100K RMB, which is not a small amount. It is, a long duration. I think it's 100K over 10 years, but nevertheless, it's real money, right? But I think this local policy wasn't matched by any central policy, or the central government basically is saying, okay, maybe the local governments should depend on your own, right, to do that. But given the finances of local governments, it's highly unlikely that there's going to be a lot of innovations in that category. I would say that the best strategy is to launch, domestically, sort of by the central government to support those who have kids. And I think there also should be support over on mortgages or even like public housing, because there are also a lot of Chinese properties that are currently, it's basically like abandoned houses. I've seen a lot of videos of those properties made by Evergrande or those property giants that are completely deserted. But these are okay houses. It's not like these are like doufu zha,
Yeah, I
right?
think some of the suggestions I saw was that basically, migrant workers they have very poor access to urban housing in Chinese cities, and and on the other hand, there were like a lot of apartments that were unsold, which is huge liabilities on these real estate companies' balance sheet. And if there is a way for the Chinese government to step in to basically turn some of those housing into some sort of like affordable housing, or even like rented apartments to these migrant workers, those were like the among the measures that were floated and by economists and we should say like respected economists who have considerable, discourse power in China. I also want to mention like, I'm not sure if you two have seen it, but I think there was one speech by Huang Qifan, the former mayor of Chongqing, and who has developed a reputation in China for his macroeconomic insights. There was an article or a speech by him from like 6 years ago where he was advocating for China to implement 3 zeros, like zero tariff, zero trade obstacle, zero barrier to trade, and zero subsidies. And I'm just saying maybe it's just like algorithm. I'm seeing on my timeline like people were talking about this. Maybe China could somehow lower its tariff to zero on a lot of goods, maybe all the goods, or maybe some of the goods to a lot of countries except the United States. I think this was like also spurred by the recent developments. And I think they were talking in the US. I think Elon Musk mentioned like the European Union and the United States should have some sort of zero tariff trading zone, but the idea seems not to be very popular with President Trump. And I think those kind of ideas are also reinvigorating some discussion on the Chinese side. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I think that just shows there are enough physical resources to support consumption, I think, because the whole system in the past has been designed to support production, right? You talk about subsidies, and it's actually most are in the forms of so-called VAT rebates for the exporters, right? And then the tariff is basically an invisible tax on the consumers. So all these are there. It's just about how and when you shift some of the producer surplus to the consumer surplus. But I think then, that's probably why it has to be coming stages, because, right now it's actually the exporters who are getting hit by this ongoing tariff war. So if you do this like instantly, like shifting, their support to consumer support, then you might have create an even bigger problem. So I imagine they were going to do it, but they only do it in a staged, phased way, so that gradually and slowly those support will be shifted towards the consumers. But I think again, all the resources are there, all the tools are in the box. It's just a matter of how and when.
But don't underestimate the degree of fiscally conservative, how fiscally conservative the Chinese government actually is. They are really dogmatic in implementing financial fiscal discipline. And I do think like if the US doesn't want to be the number one consumer market for the world, China has a long way to go. But for this country, the second largest economy in the world, to become like a huge attraction of global trade, it should gradually raise its consumption, open its doors to also increasingly more foreign products, and that is a way to if there is a grand strategy out there, is to elevate the importance of the Chinese market, not just its factories and its innovators, but also to enable others, including other developing countries and advanced industrialized economies, to benefit from the Chinese market. But obviously this is still a developing country with the GDP per capita at 13,000 USD. Is still very low, but if the US just willingly want to quit its like long-held position in the world, we are really going to see like so many changes, and maybe some of that are beyond like at least my limited imagination at the time.
Cool, guys, it's almost an hour. Do you have any final comments, thoughts?
I think a simple consumption policy won't make the cut. The reason for that is that the biggest problem for the Chinese economy right now, apart from the imbalances, is also the imbalances that we have in terms of our forex reserves. we still have the majority of our forex reserves in treasuries, right? And actually, we have a lot of U.S. stock holdings as well. If you look at the China Investment Corporation report, as well as some even illiquid asset. And so, if you want to rotate that out of U.S. dollar assets, that's going to be a long way. But I do think that's the way to be, given where the policy directives is going to happen. This sort of tariff war is just a precursor to a larger scale sort of economic boycott against China from the US. And if it's not going to happen in tariffs, which is actually to the US benefit, because tariff is actually a pretty stupid way of trying to hurt the Chinese economy. But let's say if he does like the twice the size of a Joe Biden, trying to cut down the economic ties of a higher technology, sort of the relationship between US and China, that's going to cause a lot of harm. And so does it still make sense to have?
But you saw the reports which said like Jensen Huang went to Mar-a-Lago to buy a ticket of $1 million to have dinner, and then the export control on H20 chips were dropped. I'm sure you saw that report.
Well, there's a pay-as-you-go. That's a pay-as-you-go directive right now in Mar-a-Lago. So the DC directive is no longer important as long as you pay the ticket in Mar-a-Lago. Everything can be negotiated. The problem is there's no Chinese going to Mar-a-Lago right now, or no Chinese officials going to Mar-a-Lago right now paying the dues.
Well, let's hope there is some back channel diplomacy, track 2, track 1.5, people with credibility and influence, traveling between the two capitals and trying to, to put them together. And at least that would be my hope. But Johnny, you did mention something like, there is huge Chinese assets in US dollars, in US assets. I was a little bit alarmed by some people were saying basically it's not just out of economic concerns. It would be out of like security concerns, like to move some of the Chinese assets out of the US dollars, because they were concerned like, what if like the US were beginning to not just even tax those like US or Chinese holdings, but even confiscate or just deny your access, your ownership of these assets. And I didn't know like there were like the concerns for safety of these assets had reason to, at least to people who are talking about it. And I mean, I hope they are paranoid, and I hope it's just paranoid.
That would be economic nuclear war. It will, hurt US way more than hurt China. That would just means US has no credibility whatsoever to deal with. So I won't be too afraid. But once that happened, it's just going to be another act of stupidity. So great. That's a pretty long podcast today. Shall we call it a day?
Sure.
Okay.
Good seeing you too.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Me too.
Likewise.
Okay. See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.